Welcome back to the channel. So the topic that we're going to be examining today is the Sabbath and the Lord's Day. What's the difference? Or is there a difference? We know that the Seventh-day Adventist doctrine claims that Christians observed the Saturday Sabbath until the day of worship was changed by the decree of Constantine. But is this claim actually a historical fact? Or is it true that this whole Constantine claim of changing the Sabbath to Sunday was just something that was concocted by Ellen White and the Seventh-day Adventist organization? And we know there is a lot of debate about this topic, so make sure and stick around to the end, since it's going to take us a little bit of time today to thoroughly address all of this. So let's jump in. So history tells us that one of the laws that was instituted by Constantine mandated Sunday as a day of rest for the entire Roman Empire. In fact, the edict that was made still exists, and here it is translated into English. He said, "Let all judges, the people of cities, and those employed in all trades remain quiet on the holy day of Sunday." Please make note of that phrase, holy day of Sunday. Persons residing in the country can freely and lawfully proceed with the cultivations of the fields, as it happens that the sowing of grains or the planting of vines cannot be deferred to a more suitable day, and by concessions to heaven, the advantage of the time may be lost. So in other words, he basically says that across the whole empire, Sunday is a day of rest, and he made one exception for farmers who needed to cultivate their fields. However, if you read SDA writings, they claim that Constantine did this for the sake of giving the green light to sun worship. They translate his decree by saying that he spoke of the venerable day of the sun, and that's actually an inaccurate translation of the Latin. The holy day of Sunday is the accurate translation. And it shouldn't go without it being said that none of the founders of the SDA organization, none of them had any formal education in any of the original languages of Scripture, including Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. And none of them had any formal education, even in Latin, which was the common language of the early church. So with that being said, the fact that none of the SDA founders were formally educated in Latin would correlate with how the SDA founders so terribly mistranslated the Latin here in Constantine's edict. So that being said, Constantine is definitely not giving a nod to sun worship here, as that's a very incorrect translation of the Latin on behalf of the Adventist organization. Instead, Constantine is acknowledging that Sunday is a holy day because that's the day Christians observed as their day of worship, and the term holy day of Sunday, I really don't care for, but the key point here is that Constantine was simply recognizing the day of rest that Christians had always used where they assembled, and it has always been the first day of the week, Sunday. Constantine wasn't making a rule for the church. He was making the law for the Roman Empire, and what Constantine was doing is just recognizing that Sunday was the day Christians had always met. And you can see this in the New Testament in verses like 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2, where it says, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you are to do as well." So here we can see Paul is talking about the collection for the saints who were in need, who were in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was under attack by the Roman armies, and Christians around the world were collecting money to help them through what was a very difficult time for the Jerusalem church. So Paul writes them, instructing them of how to handle that offering. And he says that he also told the churches in Galatia to do the same thing when they came together. And so this is just also very telling in that it's clear that Paul's instruction of giving offering on the first day of the week wasn't just directed at the one church in Corinth of who he's writing this letter to, but since he says that he also gave the same instruction to the churches of Galatia as well, and we know that Galatia would have included the 4 churches in Galatia, and so this passage just makes it clear that it's not just one isolated instruction to the one church in Corinth to collect offering on the first day of the week. Okay, let's check out verse 2 now. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put aside and save as he may prosper, so that no collections need to be made when I come. So here we can see Paul goes on to tell the church that when they all meet together on the first day of the week, which is Sunday, that they should be giving an offering when they assemble together as a church on the first day of the week. So let's just step back for a moment and put things into perspective here. We know that the letter of 1 Corinthians is to the church in Corinth, and it clearly says here that they were meeting together as a church on the first day of the week. And he tells them to give their offering, and we all know that church history also tells us that offering giving has always been included at church service. So clearly, they were meeting together as a church on the first day of the week, and the Apostle Paul instructed them to give their offering when they came together as a church on the first day of the week. Then another verse would be Acts 20, verse 7. On the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul began talking to them, intending to leave the next day, and he prolonged his message until midnight. So he's not saying we came together to eat together, and when he says we gathered on the first day of the week to break bread, he's talking about communion. And the last reference that's important is Revelation 1:10, where John says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. He refers to it as the Lord's day, and that was a common phrase in the early church, and we know that even from other church history writings. And it refers to the first day of the week because that's when Christians met in order to celebrate the resurrection of Christ. And it should also be of important note that the church actually started on a Sunday. In chapter 2 of the book of Acts, the day of Pentecost was on a Sunday. We know that Jesus died on a Passover, and the New Testament says that his body had to be in the grave before sunset because sunset marked the Sabbath starting, and it was on Sunday morning that he rose. The particular Sabbath, the Sabbath that follows Passover, is an important Sabbath because that's also the Feast of the Firstfruits when they offered the wave offering. And at that moment when the priest was offering the firstfruits, Christ rose from the dead. And according to 1 Corinthians 15, the firstfruits of them who slept, so the timing is really important. Christ rose on the first day of the week, and we know that Leviticus 23 sets up the precise timing for Pentecost by saying this, you shall also count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath, from the day when you brought in the sheaf of the wave offering. So here he's talking about the Feast of the Firstfruits Sabbath from the day when you brought in the sheaf of the wave offering. There shall be 7 complete Sabbaths. You shall count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath. Then you shall present a new grain offering to the Lord. That's talking about Pentecost, the Feast of Pentecost. So the day after the Sabbath was the day Christ rose. That's a Sunday. And that's day 1 in the 50-day count. So day 1, and you add 49 to that, and that's exactly 7 weeks, and you're back again on Sunday. So Pentecost was on a Sunday. And that's when the Holy Spirit, in Acts 2, filled the disciples and created the church. The timing of this wasn't just random, it's precise, and the feasts were set up for that very purpose so that the thing that was foreshadowed happened, and it happened in the exact concurrence with those feast days. So the founding of the church was on a Sunday, so the church began on the first day of the week, and that's how they continued to meet from then on. There is an enormous amount of proof in church history that was the custom from the very start of the church. For example, Ignatius of Antioch, who was an early writer, and he lived from 108 AD until about 140, So if you stop and think about how early that was, he is literally separated from the Apostle John by less than 10 years. So that being said, Ignatius absolutely knew people who knew the apostles. He is one of the earliest writers in the post-apostolic church whose works have been kept for us in history, and one of his works is called the Epistle of Ignatius to the Magnesians. And in that, chapter 9, paragraph 1, this is how he describes Christians and those who, quote, have come to the possession of a new hope, no longer observing the Sabbath, but living in the observance of the Lord's Day, on which also our life has sprung up again in him. Let us therefore no longer keep the Sabbath after the Jewish manner. And he goes on to say, let every friend of Christ keep the Lord's Day as a festival, the resurrection day, the queen and chief of all the days of the week. And that's less than 10 years after the death of the last apostle. And right there, he's saying, Sunday is the day the church meets. That's when all Christians meet, is what he says. The Epistle of Barnabas is also a very early, non-inspired epistle. That's why it's not in the scriptures. But it was written at the same time as the apostolic era, possibly written as early as 70 AD, but no later than 140 AD. And of course, Barnabas is attributed as the author, who we know was Paul's companion in ministry. And in this Epistle of Barnabas, chapter 15, verse 9, we read this, quote, the beginning of the 8th day is the beginning of another world. Therefore, we also keep the 8th day for rejoicing, in which Jesus rose from the dead, and having been manifested, he ascended to the heavens. So that's Barnabas, or at least another very early writer, and he's describing this is how the church meets. He called it the 8th day. It's the day after the 7th day. It's also the first day of the week, Sunday. Another early church writer would be Tertullian, who was born 160 AD, and keep in mind that the Apostle John died in 99 AD. So that means Tertullian could have very well known people who knew the Apostle John, and Tertullian was the first Christian author to produce an extensive corpus of Latin Christian literature, and he was also an early Christian apologist. And apologist doesn't mean apologizing. It means making a defense for Christianity. And this is what he wrote. We devote Sunday to rejoicing for a far different reason than sun worship. Others suppose that the sun is the God of the Christians, because we make Sunday a day of festivity. And he goes on to say that just as the abolition of fleshly circumcision and of the old law is demonstrated as having been consummated at its specific times, so also the observance of the Sabbath is demonstrated to have been temporary. And these three early church writers we just gave examples of are by no means the only early Christian writers who acknowledged that the church from the very beginning has always met on Sunday. And just a few of the other early church writers who give the same acknowledgement would be these. And so it's just very well documented from the very beginning of Christianity that the church was meeting on the first day of the week, on Sunday. So there is plenty of biblical and historical evidence that from the very beginning of the church, Christians met on Sunday. And like I said earlier, it's important to understand that contrary to the false teaching of Ellen White, Constantine did not change the Sabbath to Sunday. Instead, he simply recognized what Christians had already been practicing for centuries. Consider the fact that there is not one historical writing, and that includes all history books, Britannica, encyclopedia, etc., not a single historical record that corresponds with Ellen White's false teaching about Constantine changing the Sabbath to Sunday. And if you're saying to yourself that you aren't sure if you should actually accept early church history, consider the fact that we rely on early church history a lot more than a lot of people realize. And we could give many examples of this, but just one example of this is that it's the early church history alone that tells us who the authors are of the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's the early church who kept and preserved the scriptures, and we know that the early church literally guarded the scriptures with their lives. Literally, there were plenty of martyrs who died to preserve what we now have in the New Testament. So, my Adventist friends, it's time to get out of this false church of Seventh-day Adventist. I just showed you plenty of both biblical facts and historical church history facts that prove that the teachings of Ellen White and the Seventh-day Adventists are completely false. Please don't forget to hit that like button and that subscribe button for more content like this.